What happens when a worn-out address book holds the answer to a 40-year mystery that will change two families forever? Dr. Phil was mid-sentence when the guests pulled out that small brown leather book. His voice stopped. The cameras kept rolling. And then he said 4 words that no one expected. "Stop the tape. Now." What was inside that address book would reveal a truth so powerful that Dr. Phil would break every rule of his own show. 20 minutes earlier, the show had started like any other episode. Sarah Mitchell, a 52-year-old woman from Ohio, had come to the Dr. Phil stage with her son, Marcus, 24. The official topic was finding closure after loss. Sarah's mother had passed away 6 months ago, and she was struggling to move forward. "My mother raised me alone," Sarah explained to Dr. Phil, her voice steady but fragile. "I never knew my father. She told me he died before I was born. And now that she's gone, I have so many questions that will never be answered." Dr. Phil leaned forward in his chair, that familiar mix of compassion and directness in his eyes. "Sarah, sometimes the hardest part of loss is the questions that die with the person we loved." Marcus, sitting beside his mother, placed his hand on hers. "Mom's been going through Grandma's things, and it's been really hard. But there's something we found that she wanted to show you." Nobody in that studio knew that what came next would stop everything. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small, weathered address book. The brown leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. "This was tucked away in a box of my mother's papers. I'd never seen it before." Dr. Phil took the book carefully, his experienced hands immediately recognizing the weight of something significant. He opened the first page. And that's when everything changed. His expression shifted from professional curiosity to genuine shock. His eyes widened. He looked up at Sarah, then back at the book, then at his producers standing just off camera. "Stop the tape," he said quietly but firmly. "Stop the tape." The studio went completely silent. The audience, used to the rhythm of daytime television, suddenly sat up straighter. This wasn't part of the show. Something real was happening. Dr. Phil stood up, still holding the address book, and walked directly to the edge of the stage. "How long have we been recording?" he asked his senior producer. "About 20 minutes, Phil," came the reply from behind the cameras. "Don't air any of this until I say so." He turned back to Sarah and Marcus, who looked confused and frightened. "Sarah, I need you to trust me right now. What you just showed me, this isn't what you think it is." Sarah's face went pale. "What do you mean?" Dr. Phil sat back down, but his entire demeanor had changed. The professional host was gone. In his place was someone who had just stumbled onto something far bigger than a standard episode. "In this address book," he said slowly, choosing every word with surgical precision, "there's a name. Robert Mitchell. Your mother's handwriting. And next to it, there's an address in Chicago and a phone number." Sarah nodded, confused. "Yes, I saw that. I assumed that was my father's information from before he died." "Sarah," Dr. Phil said, and his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the studio lean forward. "I know that address." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. "What?" Sarah whispered. Dr. Phil looked directly at the camera, then back at Sarah. 2 weeks ago, I had a couple on this show. Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell. From Chicago. They were here because they'd been searching for their son's child for 40 years. Marcus grabbed his mother's hand. Sarah's breathing became rapid and shallow. "Hold on." Dr. Phil raised his hand, and his voice took on that commanding tone that had made him famous. "Hold on. I need to be very, very careful here." "But Sarah..." He paused, making sure he had her full attention. "The address in this book, it's the same address Elizabeth and Robert gave me. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." Sarah started crying. Not the soft tears of grief, but the gasping, trembling sobs of someone whose entire world has just shifted on its axis. Dr. Phil stood up again. I need everyone to stay calm. I need my team to do something right now. He looked directly at the senior producer. Call Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell. Tell them I need them here. Now. Today. Don't explain why. Just get them here. He turned back to Sarah and Marcus. I'm going to ask you both something that's going to sound insane. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that? They both nodded, too shocked to speak. Marcus, Dr. Phil addressed the young man directly. How old are you? 24. And Sarah, how old were you when you had Marcus? 28. Why does that? She stopped mid-sentence as the realization began to dawn. Because, Dr. Phil said softly, Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell's son, your father, didn't die 40 years ago. He died 25 years ago. And according to what they told me, he had a daughter. A daughter that his parents never got to meet because your mother disappeared before they knew she was pregnant. The studio erupted. Not in noise, but in collective shock. Audience members gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others grabbed the hands of strangers sitting next to them. Dr. Phil held up his hand for silence. We're going to take a break. A real break. Sarah, Marcus, come with me backstage. Production team, clear the stage. Get legal in here. Get our family counselor in here. And somebody get Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell on the phone immediately. As he walked Sarah and Marcus toward the backstage area, still holding that small leather address book like it was made of glass, he turned back to the audience one more time. What you're about to witness, he said, his voice carrying the full weight of 4 decades of human pain and hope, is why I do this show. This is real. This matters. And I promise you, we're going to handle this the right way. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. For the next 90 minutes, the show stopped completely. Dr. Phil sat with Sarah and Marcus in his private office, along with the show's family counselor and a genetic counselor who was rushed to the studio. They went through the address book page by page. They looked at old photographs Sarah had brought. They made phone calls. And most importantly, they waited. Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell, both in their late 70s, had been at their home in Chicago when they got the call from the Dr. Phil's show. They'd assumed it was a follow-up interview. They had no idea they were about to walk into the most important moment of their lives. When they arrived at the studio 2 hours later, Dr. Phil met them at the door personally. Not a producer. Not an assistant. Him. Elizabeth. Robert, he said, taking both of their hands. I need you to sit down for a minute before we go inside. The elderly couple looked at each other with concern. Phil, what's going on? Robert asked. Dr. Phil pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph. It was the picture of the address book, open to the page with Robert's name and their old address. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. Robert's eyes filled with tears immediately. Is that Tommy's handwriting? Elizabeth whispered, referring to their late son. No, Dr. Phil said gently. It's not Tommy's. It's the handwriting of a woman named Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. And she's here. Right now. In this building. But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. Dr. Phil led them to the stage slowly. The audience had been briefed during the break. They understood they were about to witness something extraordinary. When Elizabeth and Robert walked onto the stage and saw Sarah and Marcus sitting there, Elizabeth let out a sound that was half cry, half gasp. Sarah stood up, trembling. Marcus stood beside her, his arm around his mother's shoulders. Sarah, Dr. Phil began, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of pain. I want you to meet Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell. They are your father's parents. They are Marcus's great-grandparents. For a moment, nobody moved. 4 people stood on that stage, separated by only a few feet, but connected by decades of loss and longing. Then Elizabeth took one step forward. Then another. And then she was in front of Sarah, looking up at her with tears streaming down her face. "You have Tommy's eyes," she whispered. "Oh my God, you have my son's eyes!" And then they were all crying. Sarah and Elizabeth fell into each other's arms. Robert reached out and pulled Marcus into an embrace. The audience was openly weeping. Cameras were shaking because the cameramen were crying. Dr. Phil stood to the side, still holding that address book, and let the moment happen. After several minutes, when the initial wave of emotion had subsided enough for people to breathe, Dr. Phil gently guided everyone to sit down. He pulled his chair close to the group, creating an intimate circle despite the cameras and the audience. "I need to tell you all what I know," he said. "And then I need to help you understand what happens next." He explained how Elizabeth and Robert had been on the show 2 weeks earlier, still searching for any information about their son's child. How they'd hired private investigators over the years. How they'd never stopped hoping. He explained how Sarah's mother had her reasons for disappearing, reasons that would take time and counseling to fully understand and process. How fear and pain can make people make choices that affect generations. And then he held up the address book one more time. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is why we can never give up hope. This is why we keep searching. This is why we keep trying. Because sometimes, the answer to 40 years of questions fits in something as simple as an old address book." He placed the book gently in Elizabeth's hands. "This belongs to your family now." Elizabeth clutched it to her chest like it was made of gold. Robert put his arm around her, then reached across and took Sarah's hand. Marcus sat between his mother and his great-grandparents, the bridge between past and future. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dr. Phil called for another break, but this time he didn't take anyone backstage. He brought out chairs for everyone. He ordered food. He called in medical staff to make sure everyone was physically okay. He arranged for genetic testing to be done, not because anyone doubted the truth, but because closure requires confirmation. But most importantly, he gave them time. Hours of time. Time to talk. Time to cry. Time to laugh. Time to begin the process of becoming a family. The episode that was supposed to be 42 minutes turned into a 3-hour recording. Dr. Phil broke every rule of television production that day. But he didn't care. "This," he told his producers, "is exactly why we do this show. For moments like this. For families like this." When the show finally did air. Weeks later, after legal clearances and family counseling sessions, it became one of the highest-rated episodes in Dr. Phil history. But more importantly, it became a story that people shared, that they talked about, that gave them hope. The legacy of that day extended far beyond the studio walls. Dr. Phil arranged for Sarah and Marcus to spend time with Elizabeth and Robert in Chicago. He connected them with family counselors who specialized in reunification. He made sure they had the support they needed as they navigated the complex emotions of building relationships that should have existed for 40 years. Marcus, who had grown up without extended family, suddenly had great-grandparents who wanted to know everything about him. Elizabeth and Robert, who had spent 40 years with a hole in their hearts, finally had their son's legacy living and breathing in front of them. And Sarah, who thought she'd never know her father, now had his parents to tell her stories, to show her photographs, to help her understand where she came from. 6 months after the episode aired, Dr. Phil received a package. Inside was a photograph of 4 people, Sarah, Marcus, Elizabeth, and Robert, standing together at what appeared to be a family gathering. Everyone was smiling. Behind them, you could see other people. Cousins, aunts, uncles, a whole family that had been waiting to be complete. Attached to the photograph was a note, written in Sarah's handwriting. "Dr. Phil, my mother kept this address book hidden for a reason I may never fully understand. But somehow, it found its way to your show at exactly the right moment. You didn't just reunite a family. You taught us that it's never too late for truth. That hope matters. That families can heal. That love doesn't expire. Thank you for stopping the tape. Thank you for caring more about people than production. Thank you for showing us what matters. Dr. Phil kept that photograph on his desk. And whenever someone asked him about his most memorable episode, he would point to that picture and say, This is why I do what I do. Because sometimes, the smallest object carries the biggest truth. And sometimes, 40 years of pain can heal in a single moment of courage. And sometimes, all it takes is someone who's willing to stop the tape and say, This matters more than the show. That's the power of human connection. That's the importance of never giving up hope. And that's why some stories deserve to be shared, remembered, and celebrated forever. The address book that started it all now sits in a frame in Elizabeth and Robert's home. It's surrounded by new photographs, family gatherings, holidays, birthdays. Moments that almost never happened. A family that almost stayed broken. But because one woman brought an old address book to a television show, and because one man had the courage to stop everything and say, This matters, 2 families became one. And that's the real Dr. Phil effect. Not the television ratings. Not the viral clips. But the lives that are forever changed when someone cares enough to stop the tape and say, Let's do this right.